The Prison Camp, 1945. In 1945, the Second World War was coming to an end, but the suffering of the prisoners of war remained. The German POW camp, located in a remote region of Europe, was a place where humanity seemed forgotten. The women who were there were not just prisoners of war. They were also victims of an unrelenting system. They had been captured while trying to fight for their homeland or protect what they loved. Many were volunteers in auxiliary forces or nurses forced to wear the uniform, but they were ignored by official records, treated as less important than men. Their fate was the same: torture, deprivation, and a long wait for death or freedom. The camp was filled with dirty, overcrowded tents, and the air was heavy with fear. The women, weakened and emaciated by hunger, were in a deplorable physical state. Their faces, once determined and hopeful, were now empty and lifeless. A woman's face could tell the story of months or years of suffering. Their hands, as thin as bones, could barely move to perform daily tasks. The heavy sound of soldiers' boots echoed through the camp, indifferent to the prisoners' suffering as they continued to patrol the area. During the war, many women enlisted in the armed forces or actively participated in resistance efforts. They were not just nurses or administrative auxiliaries, but also combatants on various battlefronts. The German women who joined the military or paramilitary forces faced discrimination and distrust both from their own superiors and from enemies. They were seen as inadequate for direct combat, often relegated to secondary roles, but that didn't stop them from fighting with courage. Many became responsible for operating tanks, heavy artillery, and fighting on the front lines. Although the Nazi regime tried to conceal female participation, they were there, fighting until the last drop of blood, willing to defend their country to the end. However, women, whether combatants or not, were also victims of the war's brutality. They suffered not only the physical effects of combat, but also the social stigma of being considered deviants for being involved in a predominantly male field. In addition, being female was a vulnerability on the battlefield, and many were captured and treated even more cruelly than their male counterparts. The women who weren't on the front lines still faced the risk of becoming prisoners of war, and many were subjected to physical and psychological abuse that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When the American troops arrived at the POW camp, the change was immediately felt, but what seemed like freedom for many was, in reality, an emotional prison in a new context. The American soldiers, battle-worn and tired, observed the devastation around them. For many, this was a victory, the end of a nightmare. But for the women in the camp, the arrival of the soldiers didn't necessarily mean freedom. The prisoners were traumatized, some with obvious signs of abuse, while others had been so deeply affected by deprivation that they could barely speak. The women, in a sense, didn't know what to expect. After the fall of the Nazi regime, some still believed that their actions, whether as soldiers or civilians involved in resistance activities, might be seen with contempt by the victors. The sense of helplessness after years of suffering now turned into a desperate fear that freedom was only another form of control, not the promised salvation. Among the American soldiers who had entered the POW camp, one man in particular stood out. He was a man with a cold, almost impersonal gaze, his expression marked by the cruelty of battle. As he approached a group of prisoners, He looked at them with the detachment of a predator observing its prey. He didn't care about their stories or their suffering. In his eyes was nothing but a reflection of the war, a look that had been hardened by years of violence. When he approached one of the women, a younger and visibly frailer one, he spoke without hesitation. "You're mine now." The soldier wasn't talking about literal ownership, but about a psychological power he felt he had over those women. They had been prisoners of war, but now he would treat them as property, as though the war had given him the right to decide their fates. The words cut through the air. For the prisoners, there was no real freedom in those words, only the continuation of humiliation and control. The brutality of the war had stripped them of almost everything, and now it seemed that even the end of the war wouldn't bring peace. As the soldier watched from a distance, the prisoners slowly began to understand what was happening. They had been fed, but the gesture seemed impersonal, as if they were merely discarded objects. The American guards began to give orders for them to be moved, but no one was treated with dignity. The women didn't know if they were being liberated or if they were still trapped. They had been prisoners, not just of a regime, but of a psychological system that saw them as secondary, only an extension of a war they never chose to fight. Each meal offered seemed insufficient to fill the emptiness created by months of suffering. The hunger was visible on their bodies, but the most devastating thing was the emptiness in their eyes. They were prisoners not only of physical torment, but also of a mindset that reduced them to mere objects in a game they had never been able to control. Although the women were physically weak, there was something unbreakable in them, a will to survive, a silent resistance that could not be shattered. They, united by their pain, began to help one another, sharing the little resources they had. Some tried to feed the weaker ones, others held the hands of those who seemed to faint from exhaustion. There was no need for words. Silence was the only language left. They had lost so much during the war, families, friends, dignity, yet there was still something within them that couldn't be taken away. The fear was still present, but there was also an invisible strength, a hope that persisted even if it was just a distant glimmer of life. Even when everything seemed lost, they were there, trying, in whatever remained of them, to resist. As time passed, the soldier, tired of observing, decided to give orders for the women to be moved to a safer camp, or at least that was what he said. They were escorted to the refugee camp where they would be treated. But the sense of freedom was absent. For the women, the refugee camp was just another stage in a long cycle of abuse and suffering. They were led by American soldiers, but the feeling of liberation was missing. Their bodies were free, but their spirits, marked by years of war and abuse, couldn't be healed so easily. The soldier, who had once given impersonal and cruel orders, now watched from a distance, as if his control over them had been completely stripped. But for the women, physical liberation didn't bring relief. They were free, but the scars of the war and the abuse would remain with them forever. The refugee camp was not the paradise they had imagined. The tents were makeshift, the space cramped, and the food, though better than at the POW camp, was still scarce. However, there was something there that made them think about the future, even though it was uncertain. They began to group together, sharing stories and forming bonds. But the pain of everything that had happened was still palpable. The trauma of war could not be healed just by the end of the fighting. It was a wound too deep to ignore. The women were physically free, but true freedom, freedom to heal their souls and hearts, seemed far away. They knew that the road to recovery would be long and full of obstacles, but at least they were together, no longer as prisoners, but as survivors. Each woman had her own story, her own painful memories of the war. Some had lost their families, others had been forced to fight on the front lines, and many had been captured and abused. These memories didn't fade easily. They were free physically, but their minds were still trapped in a past that could never be erased. In the refugee camp, some women tried to move forward, but the shadow of the war still haunted them, day and night. They were free, but the marks of their experiences continued to shape them. Despite all the suffering, a small spark of hope began to grow within them. They were in a new camp, physically safer, but true liberation was in learning to live again. The future seemed uncertain, but life, with all its pains and challenges, was still worth living. They knew that by walking together, they could find strength. The video ends with the image of these women walking toward a new beginning, one step at a time. The war had destroyed them, but still, the hope for a better future remained in their hearts.